whether Coyne meant it or not, he actually said the truth when he said, in science's pecking order, evolutionary biology lurks somewhere near the bottom, far closer to the pseudo-science of phrenology than the physics. I'm just like, amen, you said it. You said it better than ever I could.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, Bible student, amateur comedian. It's great to be with you, Fred, talking about real science on Friday.
Well, thanks, Doug. And we're going to welcome back to the RSR airwaves Sal Cordova. We had a part one of our show last week, and it was so good. And Sal was gracious to come back and be on the air with us. So, Sal, welcome back to Real Science Radio.
And thank you for having me back.
Yes, and Sal, thank you for helping us expose the fact that experimental evidence has already killed evolution, and we're just letting the world know. Thank you, and God bless you.
Yeah, for those who missed that, go back to the last show. It was really a lot of fun stuff. And Sal, you mentioned, which was nice for me to hear, that you had actually come across my website years ago, evolutionfairytale.com. And you mentioned the exploding giraffe head. I do want to give kudos out to my brother, Larry, who actually did all the artwork for that website. So anyways, thanks for that.
Oh, thank you. And I hope if we do have time, we can talk about the similarity of humans and chimpanzees. That's a very compelling topic, one that was that nearly destroyed my faith, and also Michael Denton's before he wrote the book, Evolutionary Theory in Crisis. That's a very interesting topic. It relates to my research in protein folding. I do want to mention that I am an engineer. I'd worked in the aerospace and defense industry, and people may be wondering, well, what are you doing, Sal, talking about biology? And it used to be the evolutionary biologists to say, you're butting into stuff you don't know. You're an engineer. That is changing now. I have from November 2006, MIT News, it says one third of the engineers at MIT work on biology problems. That's because they have the right skill set. They have the right skill set. My professor at the NIH FES graduate school in cellular neuroscience, he was a PhD in electrical engineering. The NIH hired him on the spot, even though he had no biology background. Zero. Yeah.
There's such a crossover.
But actually, he did. They needed someone to understand, to help them with the ear. If you think about what the ear does, it transduces the vibrations in the air, which is kinetic energy. You have to convert it to a signal, an electrical signal. The signal has to be processed. It's something akin to Fourier series and Fourier transforms. It then has to be digitally or analog recorded somewhere, because it's amazing you can remember a familiar sound. You don't think how hard this is.
Yeah.
Okay. We are understanding how difficult it is when we do voice recognition. I have an in-law who he has these big server farms that he needs to be able to process voice recognition. And so this PhD in electrical engineering had the right skill set. They said, you had the right skill set to help us figure out how, the human hearing system works. We don't need someone who's going to tell us fairy tales of evolution and all they can do is phylogenetic diagrams of supposed ancestor of this or that, and it's not going to work anyway. We need someone who can actually solve problems and understand how the parts fit together and what they do.
Yeah. So knowledge of software engineering, firmware engineering. Dr. Royal Truman, who we had on roughly a month ago, he brought up the same point. I mean, there's this engineering discipline that is so tied to biology now and genetics, because God is the ultimate designer and engineer, and we see his design in the genome.
Yes. I'm sorry to get on a tirade there, but when I was reading your stuff, Scott Page was just kind of bullying me and said, you're not a biologist. And that kind of got under my skin. And I said, I'm going to study biology. I said, it'll be a cross to bear, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. So for context, Dr. Scott Page was a guy that I was debating pretty heavily back in the day on evolutionfairytale.com. We had a forum there that at one time was very active. And so, Sal, you're referring to the debates I was having with him. And one of them, we talked about, the whole Poisson distribution that showed that each breeding couple, at the very best case at that time, way back in, I think it was probably early 2000s, One female would have to have 40 offspring just to give evolution a chance. The last show, you can go hear more about that. It's actually a number that's like 10 to the 35th power. So, Sal, thanks for referencing that. I'd totally forgotten about that, my debate with Dr. Scott Page.
Well, I remember that. And, it took the engineers and mathematicians. We recently published on this in secular peer review. We overturned Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection.
Mm-hmm.
We found one way of overturning it. It turned out it's been overturned quietly by other evolutionary biologists, but they don't publish.
Right.
They'll publish, but it's kind of, there's not a lot of fanfare. After Bill Basner and John Sanford published their criticism of Fisher's fundamental theorem, a year later, Joe Felsenstein, who's probably the top population geneticist, he said, alas, this is at Fisher's memorial lecture. It was really kind of funny.
Oh, that's funny. Ironic.
That's kind of a nice way to, here we're honoring the dead here and all of his accomplishments. But I got to tell you, alas, Fisher's fundamental theorem is not so fundamental after all. Yeah. And he gave alternate proof.
And he learned himself because he met the creator who actually designed and made everything.
It's interesting. Again, we'll talk about theistic evolutionists. Fisher was a devout Christian as far as we know.
Okay.
And so there was always this divide between the evolutionists who profess Christianity. Joe Felsenstein said, I don't know that I really would want to meet him because we have such cultural differences. And it's probably the fact that Ronald Fisher's a Christian. You know who has actually advanced a lot of evolutionary theory? It's people professing to be Christians.
Oh, I've been saying that for years. I've been saying you got to drop this because they're going to blame us for this, just like they try to blame the flat earth on the Christians. Just get away from all of this stuff.
Well, what happened was I was talking at Lipscomb University, and I was giving a talk on the ENCODE project. Had nothing to do with creationism. But I mentioned John Sanford and, the hostility. I said, this is a Christian college. And when you talk to some of these, if you talk to the creationist community, especially the speakers, you'll see how the hostility when they talk on Christian campuses toward their creationist views and ID. Yeah. You look at Baylor. Baylor expelled Bill Dembski. They censured Robert Marks, who were ID proponents. Right. And they have this building that said he created all things, a quote from the New Testament.
Yeah.
Wow. You can't. Yes, they're expelling it. You go to Christian seminaries. They either de-emphasize it or they persecute you. So, it's just kind of one of those things, but that's neither here nor there. We're here to talk about real science.
I think it's here and there. It's just like the late, great Bob Enyart said, if you trade Genesis, what are you trading it for? Especially as a Christian, especially as a Christian institution, it's shameful. And I'm just glad that we're calling them out on it. That's real. That's real science.
And it's happening also in the pulpits, unfortunately, and not always the fault of the pastor. See, this is what's good at, we're here to talk real science. And when you talk real science, which unfortunately the seminaries don't want to talk about, then the truth comes out. And so this engineering viewpoint is very important for us to really understand the greatest machines in the universe, and those are biological systems.
Amen.
And it's only now in the 21st century that we're realizing, oh my goodness, this is beyond anything we can build. So I've asked biochemists, senior biochemists, I've asked physicists, I said, okay, let's just take the photosynthesis system, or how about even just an individual protein, like the topoisomerase. And I asked the biochemist this. I said, okay, if I gave you the requirement specification, you're going to build a protein that can untangle the DNA by cutting it and then reconnecting it together. Also, it has to figure out that it's knotted. Could you build that from scratch? And by the way, the requirement is it's going to be about only the spelling of the letters is only going to be about 1,600 letters, 1,600 amino acids, 1,700, whatever. Do you think you could do that if you didn't have God's design already there as you could copy? He said, no way. Probably the primary discipline that I see is biochemistry, but now we're seeing computational computer scientists, physicists, mathematicians, engineers. the thing that's usually lacking are evolutionary biologists because they cannot figure out the machines of life. In fact, the reason that they don't want to figure out the machines of life, there was someone from my alma mater at George Mason. He said, biologists need to stop calling these things machines. And I'm like,
Wow.
he said, that's just terrible. You're making people think this is design. Stop using the word design. Stop using the word function. Stop using the word machine. This is bad. You're corrupting the kids.
Yeah, it's like when Eugenie Scott said, stop debating creationists. We're losing. I mean, she didn't add the part we're losing, but that's why she said stop debating them, because we're losing the argument.
Bruce Alberts, he was like the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He called biology all these machines. And some evolutionary biologists were upset because a machine can break down. There's this book, I just got to laugh. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's called Survival of the Sickest, Why We Need Disease. Look at this. Yeah. Survival of the Sickest, Why We Need Disease. And I realized, gee, do you have such a scarcity of examples of beneficial mutations? You have to appeal to like birth defects. And the book said, look, Darwin is such a genius, and he, this is an extension of his theory. Not only survival of the fittest, survival of the sickest.
Yeah.
And it was a New York Times bestseller. Just like, guys, do you not see? Are you having problems? Is there some cognitive dissonance? This is not where we go.
Well, it's amazing because through the years, evolutionists have used disease. I had one PhD scientist guy use cancer as evidence of evolution. And it reminds me, Sal, we talked about it last week, a debate you had with a guy named Dan that's on the internet. And I watched that debate, and it was interesting when he was talking about fitness and, beneficial mutations that occur in context. He's trying to, soften the blow, but he used sickle cell anemia, a disease, as an example of evolution. When NFL football players come to play in Denver at Mile High, if they have sickle cell disease, if they have one of the genes that are, for sickle cell, it's still a harmful effect and they can't play at altitude. And they say, well, but it's good for you if you're in a malaria-infested environment. I guarantee you, though, if you ask that person, what would you rather have? Not sickle cell disease or a U-Haul to move out of the malaria-infected area? I mean, I would choose not to have a disease, but yet they use it as an example. They used lactose intolerance as an example of a beneficial mutation. Well, I know a lot about lactose intolerance because that's me. I suffered that for 50 years until I figured out what was wrong. And so what's the advantage that the fact that you can still drink milk? And you can speak maybe on this, Sal. I saw that there are studies where they think that everybody was lactose intolerant like 5,000 years ago. So that tells me that the original design was you were supposed to wean off of milk. Well, then some mutation occurred that spread through the population where more people could kind of tolerate milk as an adult. But anyways, this Dan guy used that as an example of improved fitness.
Well,
remarkable.
Well, it would have been a difficult argument back then. I got to tell you, I cannot keep up with the peer-reviewed literature because we could even make better arguments now. I'll just say, look, it's even easier now. How about just loss of genes? I'll just cite these papers, loss of genes. So like Lenski's mutator, the infamous Lenski experiment on E. coli and citrate utilization. There are some of the lines, strains that he developed. One of them is a mutator strain. And the title of the paper is Genome Decays Despite Sustained Fitness Gains. This is like survival of the sickest.
Survival of the sickest.
I just like, okay, yeah, survival of the sickest. Now, what happened when we published our paper on Fisher's not so fundamental theorem of natural selection? We were looking at this, and I remember, I think I could share this. I said, John, I got to tell you, either I'm crazy or the rest of the world is crazy. Someone's out of step. I said, all of this is garbage. Yeah, I was calling him. I said, okay, I was working on this paper that was published in Springer Nature. The title of it's a chapter. The title of the chapter is Dynamical Systems and Fitness Maximization in Evolutionary Biology. And we were highlighting Fisher's fundamental theorem and its flaws, and then we added some follow-ons. And as I was going through the math, I said, and I talked to Joe Felsenstein, the top population geneticist, And as I looked at the math, I said, this is garbage. So the way, and I got to tell you, Richard Lewontin of Harvard, he was one of the big names. I mean, he may not be as recognizable as the big three who founded neo-Darwinism. That would be Ronald Fisher, Sewell Wright, and J.B.S. Haldane. But there's some also totally brilliant guys like Richard Lewontin. Lewontin published a paper that said the confusions of fitness. And that was just devastating. It's been, no evolutionist really came out and said he was wrong, but no one really wanted to exactly highlight his paper. And let me summarize. Andreas Wagner is also a respected evolutionary biologist in our time. He said, okay, this makes it so easy when I want to debate evolutionists. And I only found this recently. Beyond the commonplace that fitness means the ability to survive and reproduce, fitness is difficult to define properly and nearly impossible to measure rigorously. Fitness is difficult to define properly and nearly impossible to measure rigorously. Like, oh my goodness, you want to talk about real science? Okay, basic measurements in physics. You want to be able to measure weight, mass. You want to measure mass? You can measure velocity, you measure length, you measure time. In fact, you don't actually need, if you can't define it rigorously directly, you can at least measure it. So, it's it's hard to define some of these quantities without being circular. But you want to have a scientific theory, at least have a way of measuring it and at least have a definition that holds water.
Well, and I think we have, if I remember correctly, third grade gymnastics, we had a number of ways to measure fitness. There's
yes. And this is, okay, exactly. And what Lewontin said, and that's a very key insight. So when you want to measure an athlete, or you want to just, if you're a doctor, you want to measure the fitness of any kid.
Right.
You measure you take the vitals, you check his eyes, his ears. It's not one single number. And what Lewontin said, the problem is in dynamical theories, this whole thing of fitness, you cannot describe it by single unitary scalar, which means you can't have a single number to define fitness. Yeah. And in evolutionary population genetics, the way they define fitness is by a single number. It's your reproductive efficiency.
Yeah.
And so that's how come you can have genome decays despite sustained fitness gains.
So that's how you dress it up. That you have to hide a whole bunch of other stuff.
Well, realize too that Lewontin was the guy. And I'm paraphrasing something to the effect that as a materialist, we can't allow a divine foot in the door. It's one of the quotes that we've used before for this guy from Harvard. His worldview doesn't allow him to allow a divine foot in the door.
Yes. And I mean, I'll just read a little bit from Lewontin here. No concept in evolutionary biology has been more confusing and has produced such a rich literature as that of fitness. The confusion has risen because a concept originally introduced as an inexact metaphor by Darwin has come to play an analytic role in formal quantitative dynamics. I mean, this is a devastating essay. I mean, we're talking about real science. As an engineer, if you cannot find a way to measure something that's really valuable to you, like mass, velocity, this is a really bad situation. And so if I'm criticizing evolutionary biology, I'm going to go right for the jugular and say, look, guys, you're saying fitness increases and you can't even define it. Why don't I read Andreas Wagner? He said, beyond the commonplace that fitness means the ability to survive and reproduce, fitness is difficult to define properly and nearly impossible to measure rigorously. Taken together, these difficulties mean that an unassailable measurement of any organism's fitness does not in practice exist. So Darwin's Origin of Species, edition 6, he had like multiple editions. In edition 6, I think it's chapter 4, he says natural selection, survival of the fittest. He adopted Herbert Spencer, who came up with the term, and now that's a description of natural selection, survival of the fittest. And in chapter 6, Darwin said organs of extreme perfection and complication, organs of extreme perfection and complication. And he was saying natural selection can build this. But when we actually start to put this to, we tried to have the population geneticists work this out. They said, okay, this is all reproductive efficiency. So we're going to try to evolve an eye by reproductive efficiency. And then you began to see leads to all sorts of circular reasoning. And it's really funny. There's a paper by R.H. Brady that said, the fit is the one that makes the most, and the one that makes the most is the most fit. He said that is what they call in philosophy, and I'm not really, this is out of my ballpark, but he said these are analytic statements. These tautologies are fine in mathematics, but what you need for science is a synthetic statement. And I'm just like, the emperor has no clothes, because this is then why you get these ridiculous statements that genomes decay despite sustained fitness gains, or gene loss by natural selection, or
so
genome reduction is the dominant mode of evolution, or survival of the sickest.
Yeah,
that has
that's
to be one of my
classic.
favorite. Survival of the sickest.
And doesn't it point out that the thing that Darwin was at least willing to admit he had to define, which was fitness, evolutionists now say cannot be defined.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless you're willing to go to a design definition of fitness. A design. Because,
but they can't let that divine foot in the door.
That's not allowed.
Well, it's really funny because there is one researcher who he did speak about his religious views. I don't think he's a creation. I'm definitely not a creationist. It's William Bialek or Bialek. I pronounce it. Forgive me, William, Dr. Bialek. He's a Princeton biophysicist. He started to use engineering metrics. I mean, maybe unwittingly. He said, you know what? I mean, just take an example, geometric optics. The eye is either in focus or not. Optometrists, ophthalmologists know this.
Right.
And he started doing the physics. He said, this is amazing because, when you look at the structure of the eye for a human versus that of a fly, he said, when you work out the mechanics of it, for the reason the fly has, all these multiple eyes and the way it's built is if you're building the optics of something that small, that's the optimal design. And he had this lecture, the Hans Bethe Memorial Lecture, and it was more perfect than we imagined, more perfect than we imagined. And there are a lot of biophysicists that are saying, look, so many things about the biological system. The evolutionary biologist said this is clumsy and junk, etc. Jerry Coyne and others have been saying, the eye is terribly designed, but they never really consulted modern day optical engineers and electromagnetic theorists.
Yeah. Yep.
Jerry Coyne was just railing on that. And then some physicists said, no, this is spectacular. It enables waveguides at the visible light spectrum. And I talked to a Department of Defense engineer who works on waveguides. He said, that's amazing. I mean, you have to be exact. You can't miss. You have to have things just the right size to build waveguides, especially like in radios, which is what he was doing in the radio spectrum. But he said that's true of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. There again, this is why you need engineers to understand biology, because that's the language that it's written in.
Yeah,
you need to have physics. You need to, you have to have the language of photons. You cannot detect light intensity any less than photons. So the eye is perfect. We found out even the human eye with some difficulty can detect an individual photon. Our smelling system can detect individual molecules. It doesn't get much better than that.
Well, Sal, Bob interviewed a guy who was an expert, an eye doctor, an ophthalmologist, and he wrote a book called The Evolution of the Eye. So Bob interviewed him, and that particular book never had one example of how the eye evolved. It was more just about the design of the eye. So they can't explain it. It's remarkable how many hoops they have to jump through. And I'm so glad we've got guys like you looking at the research and, just and a lot of this cutting edge stuff. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, we had Dr. Royal Truman on the show roughly a month ago, and he said that you have to have information science and computer science knowledge to really look at this stuff in the genome. And, this whole ENCODE project that we brought up, it's just great stuff. So, Sal, I wanted you to maybe touch base on something else I saw in the debate that you had with this scientist, Dan, who was promoting evolution. He had a slide where he showed that transposons which made up roughly 44% of the genome, were all non-functional. So that was news to me. Now, these are the jumping genes, right? Amazing design
Sure.
and software where you can actually move pieces of the genome around and then they do some different function. I mean, I can't imagine as an engineer writing code that, well, in a way it'd be kind of like a subroutine, but
Well, let me fill you in on that.
Sure.
Yeah. If I could finish out my thought though on the fitness,
Oh, sure,
I'd like to close out with one more example.
Sure.
Because I was in the aerospace and defense industry. I was a pilot, and my least favorite instrument for navigation was the magnetic compass. The Arctic tern is a bird that can fly from North Pole to South Pole. There's some Arctic tern birds that can fly 40,000 miles a year. They do this, we believe now, by magnetic navigation. There's the cryptochrome protein. We have the cryptochrome protein, but the bird has it. It's able to sense the magnetic fields by something called the hyperfine transitions. It can sense the electron spin going up or down. And when there's a hyperfine transition, it helps it build this compass needle. Now, as someone who's done aviation and maritime navigation studies, because that was part of my job and the later part of my job in the aerospace industry, you think about the thousands of years where we had to be able to build, get guys just not to die out in sea when they're sitting out in the sea. They had to have very precise clocks so they could navigate. I don't quite know the reason for that. They had to have very precise maps of the stars and stuff like that. They had to have good compasses. This is pre-GPS. And yet these birds are able to do these hyperfine transition detections. And one of the top world chemists, Marcos Eberlin, in his book Foresight, cited other papers and said, no chemist on the planet can build systems that can detect these hyperfine transitions. Because you have to put the chemical in a quantum state. No chemist has been able to do that. It has to sustain it. And what William Bialek is saying, just about, when you get to see some of this where it can sense, also sharks can sense electric fields. I asked a radar engineer, I said, this can sense nanovolts per meter. He said, I expect that's about the threshold of detection. And so these physicists are like, some of the sensory organs in living systems are at the edge. You're not going to build a better system. You're not going to. And we know that because we're trying to build it and we can't. And like you said, not just one number. Ability of the ear, by the way, it's also optimized to the limits of physics. The eye is optimized to the limits of physics. Your nose is. So you have all of these metrics. You no longer define it by reproductive success, but by capability, like an engineer would. That is something the evolutionary biologists do not want to go. They want to hold on to their definition because what the alternative is. So they're fighting tooth and nail to prevent the machine paradigm, the engineering viewpoint of biology, which is the correct viewpoint, that it is designed, it has an architecture, and by the way, it is put together at the limits of physics. No scientist on the planet will exceed this. It is the best that can possibly be made.
Yeah.
So thank you for letting me finish out that thought.
Yes. Now, before we go on, I think that's the crux of this entire interview. So you are positing the design argument against, and the fitness argument against the other side who wants to try to imply that athletes improve their capabilities as their limbs are chopped off. That's the level of the debate we're at. That's literally what they have to argue that. And so let's keep that in mind and don't get distracted by trying to argue about the limbs being chopped off, because we have a much higher plane that we can argue from.
Yes, and I just been, it's been painful sometimes to see the creationists debating about, Tiktaalik or whatever. I mean, it's an important debate to have, but the debate that I felt really needed to be is this thing, the shifting paradigm, the definition of what it means to be fit. Because if they give away and say what it means to be fit, we have to define it in terms of the limits of physics, which is really an engineering problem. You're going to give away the store, and they're going to fight that tooth and nail. But like I said, when we're trying to figure out biology so we could effect medical cures, what will prevail? Is it reproductive capacity that really matters, or how the machines of life work? And so grudgingly, the medical industry is like, well, we really we don't need the evolutionary biologists.
Yeah, we need the ones like you said, where MIT, a third of them are going into genetics
I
that
would
are
say
engineered.
you want someone who can reverse engineer the parts and say this part probably does that. So like in the case of my professor of cellular neuroscience who had no biology, he was a PhD in electrical engineering. He had the right skill set to say, okay, I think this is what this does. And you're always dealing with electrical potentials when you're dealing with nerves.
Yeah.
If you actually, I think, Fred, are you an electrical engineer?
So my degree is electrical engineering, and I gravitated mostly towards firmware and software design.
Yes. So if you look at some of these neural circuits, the description of a nerve cell, you'll see familiar circuit diagrams. You'll see resistors and capacitors.
Exactly.
And it's like, that's why you need an electrical engineer.
Yeah.
Because he has the right way to conceptually model the parts of biology. I'm seeing now a lot of stuff like you need engineers to understand fluid dynamics. There's a lot of fluid dynamics, both like, say, in the macro scale where you have sharks.
Yeah.
Okay, I know one creationist. He's an MIT PhD. He gave a talk on fluid mechanics because he's talking about the efficiency of building our submarines. He said, well, I wish we could build them like the way God built the fish, because the fish are so efficient in the way they manage fluid dynamics. There's all sorts of physics and engineering things. And you're asking me about junk DNA. The engineers, and this is probably a good segue to answer your question about that, because it's the engineering paradigms that have helped us understand what the evolutionists call junk. We're now realizing these are Turing-complete computers on probably many levels.
Yes.
Okay, so the first thing is there is this paper called the chromatin computer. And it's really funny. I when I give talks about this, if you look at the old magnetic memory, the wires wrapped around the magnetic cores, our chromatin looks like that.
Interesting.
So like
wow.
Yes, I saw an electron microscopy of the chromatin, and it looks like the old magnetic core memory, where the thing called histones are like spools that the DNA wraps around.
Yeah.
And it looks like an abacus. It looks like a computer, but it is way more sophisticated. It is way more sophisticated.
That doesn't sound like junk, or, just because it doesn't code for something specifically. Wow. That's amazing.
Okay. So on one level, and actually this was in the second part 2 of my debate with Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, and I talked about the chromatin and the chromatin computation. So you have these, let me describe it, and this is going to try to answer your question about transposons a little bit, but just to give you the flavor.
Okay.
So if we look at the genome, not just as a source of blueprints, only about 2% of the genome provides the blueprints for the proteins. The other 98% do other things. And that's why they said most of it's junk. But then you realize, you need all the regulatory regions. But then what about all these repetitive elements, et cetera? So the first thing is, let's look at the chromatin computation. And a researcher said, okay, this is a Turing complete machine. This is incredible. So it's a finite state machine. And the way it works is you have these histones that have kind of like tape. We call it a tail. So back in the days of computers where you had tape and punch card, this is what it's kind of like. So you have these readers, writers, and erasers that go to the histone tails, and it modifies it chemically. It flips the bits on or off. And sometimes it's a multi-state position. So the quality of your skin at your eyelid is different from the quality of the skin at the sole of your foot. The way this works is on chromosome 12, you have a link RNA that is coded from a link DNA, which they used to call junk. And this thing hops on a bus called SUS12, and through the process of quote unquote Brownian motion, it somehow navigates to chromosome 2, finds the right Hox cluster, finds the right histone out of the 4 classes on that spool, looks at the 27th amino acid on that histone tail. I mean, this is a genome of 3.3 gigabases. It's going to find the right histone.
Remarkable.
It's going to navigate without active propulsion. It's going to go to one amino acid on the histone tail. The histone's wrapped around by the DNA. It's going to methylate it. And that methyl change is like flipping a bit. That's the difference between will cause the development of your eyelid skin to be different than your skin at the sole of your foot.
Yeah. And
When
what you
this was
just
published, this was the greatest paper in the journal Cell. The editor said this was the greatest paper because everyone thought that was junk DNA. And it was way more sophisticated. If I showed you, you might want, if we could ever show the polycomb repression complex 2, polycomb repression complex 2, you'll actually see all the machines, the read and write and erase machines. This is incredible. Your DNA acts in conjunction with the histones, acts like a memory device. Now, does it make sense now? I mean, if you ever looked at, a server farm, it looks like computers are all identical. Okay,
what a great
no
analogy.
engineer in the right mind would say this is junk because they're all identical.
Yeah, and so
that's right.
I mean, that really, what you're proving here, showing is that in your debate with this Dan is totally dismissing this, and it was the biggest part of his chart was 44% transposons. He's like, oh, we can ignore those because it's not functional, and you've just really precisely refuted that. I mean, that's super exciting stuff, especially from an engineering perspective.
Okay. So back specifically to the transposons, there's one class called the ALU elements. The ALU elements.
Yep.
By the way, I used to call it ALU because for a computer guy, you call that arithmetic logic unit.
True.
All right. And the biologists keep getting them. I said, no, it's not ALU, it's ALU for ALU factor or whatever. Okay. I said, whatever. I said, maybe it's a divine coincidence, providential, because it's not far from the truth.
Yeah.
So Francisco Ayala said, well, we have millions of copies. This is an incompetent designer. He was assailing Stephen Meyer in 2010. He said, there's no intelligent design. This is like pages and pages of the same thing, pages and pages. And we know that when you change it, it causes disease. And it's like, Francisco Ayala, former Catholic priest. He said, there's no designer. That's incompetent. That's stupid. And I said, okay, by way of analogy, it's like, okay, why would anyone get 1 million phone books? You only need one. Back in the day when you had phone books, like the Yellow Pages. And I said, I think that's actually a pretty good argument, Francisco Ayala. I mean, it bothered me. It bothered me at the time. And I said, God, I got to trust you because I have no solution to this. I think I could say this now. I was at a conference and John Sanford said, I believe in design, but, the one thing that would get me back, he said, the one thing that really kind of is difficult for me, and this is in 2016, he said, it's that ALU element. If anything would make me an evolutionist again, it would be that ALU element. So I mean, even someone like me and him said, I all had a good point. So John Sanford comes up to me and says, hey, Sal, that's your next assignment. Why don't you go figure out what that does?
Okay.
All right.
Just like, God.
Yeah.
I'm talking to a world famous geneticist. He's asking me, who's just like, I only had one biology class at that time. He said, I'm like, okay. I said, all right. I was assigned. I said, okay, the only thing I could do is Google. Okay. That's all I could do is Google. I said, God, please. And it turned out there were all these experiments that were being done. And one of them said, oh, these ALU transcripts, their RNA transcripts are chemically modified. I'm like, you mean as in zeros and ones? And I looked at it. I looked at the layout of it and I saw all what they call post-transcriptional modifications on RNA. Some people call it the epitranscriptome. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is computer code. And lo and behold, their papers that are published, they said, this is what distinguishes humans from other primates. We have so many RNA editing with the ADAR enzyme, far more than any other creature. And this seems to grant us the intelligence. These are like zeros and ones, these RNA edits.
Wow.
These zeros and ones. And I said, server farm.
Exactly.
I said,
yeah.
This is the problem when you have an evolutionary biologist versus an engineer. An engineer would look at this and say, look, this looks like a big memory unit. And it's a massive memory unit. We're only beginning to understand the computation it's doing.
Exactly.
And it's probably a very sophisticated computation. And I said, now the door is wide open. And I did not really appreciate that. I didn't have a chance to pursue it, but now I even find even more things. There's something by, I think his name is Jake Hebert. He published in the Royal Society. I mean, that's their big, their big scientific organization. He called it the flip on, flip off. And he talks about all these experiments talking about it being a computational computer. He said, we have verified it. It's amazing. It's powerful. Of course, he said, evolution optimized it. He has to give acknowledgement. But I said, this kind of just blown away. I mean, we're not going to lose this debate. This is what I was talking about. We have experiments now. This is real science. You saw real evolutionary biology have fake science. They can't even define their central quantity. They can't measure it. That's fake science. They've been building this industry, calling it science. They can't even measure. They cannot define their central quantities, and then it's just blowing apart. This is why I get accused of quote mining Jerry Coyne. But I said, whether Coyne meant it or not, he actually said the truth when he said, in science's pecking order, evolutionary biology lurks somewhere near the bottom, far closer to the pseudo-science of phrenology than the physics. I'm just like, amen. You said it. You said it better than ever I could.
Yeah. So that actually, Sal, we're actually out of time. That might be a point to end on, but there's so much more I want to cover. You've got fantastic stuff. So I'd like to ask you to come back on some future show, maybe in a month or two. We've got other shows already planned and lined up, but this was so fun. And you've got so much cutting edge stuff that I really want our audience to hear. So I would like to invite you back on in a month or two if you're willing and able. There's so much we have to cover that we haven't even gotten into.
Yes, and I very much appreciate the statement you made. We're not going to lose this debate. We're not going to lose this debate. And praise the Lord, we can't lose it because He's the way, the truth, and the life. And we're on the side of the truth. And thanks for reminding us and the audience of that indisputable fact.
Yes.
Thank you, and glory and honor to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, the creator and the designer.
Exactly. Amen. And Sal, you hit it right on the head with what I think, and I think what you were saying. There's a lot of work, your cutting edge work. We need to focus on this biggest nail in the coffin. I agree with you that, Tiktaalik and fossils and all that, they have their place in the debate. But this is such a big nail that's striking such a devastating blow to evolution right through their heart. It's real science. You're actually appealing to science that we observe a lot of this stuff. We see it in action, and we're seeing that in the ENCODE project, if ENCODE is true, evolution is wrong. So anyways, again, Sal, it was such an honor to have you on the show, and we're going to have you back on. It sounds like you're willing to do so, we're so thankful for.
Yes.
So, and if, for our listeners, please, if you want to help the show, we don't have a mega church backing us. Please go to rsr.org/store and either sponsor a show. You can buy some of our materials or just do a monthly donation. That would be great. We are also wanting you to go to crtl.org. That's Colorado Right to Life, as they have a fundraiser right now to raise funds to put up billboards that will witness and reach out to women who are coming across the state borders to come into Colorado, which has become a destination for abortions. And these billboards have proven to have a very strong effect on these people. So we're saving lives. So go to crtl.org and also please consider giving them a donation. So for Doug McBurney and Sal Cordova, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.